Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today we welcome you to a CE3C Encontro Ciência. The talk will be recorded, so I ask anyone who does not want to appear to keep the video turned off. This video will be later available on CE3C YouTube channel. We are quite pleased to have today as our speaker Pedro Pinho, who I thank in advance for being available to be here today and sharing his work and the nice work he's doing. Pedro will be presented by Helena Serrano, who I thank in advance and who I now give the floor. Thank you, Helena, and thank you, Pedro. If you have questions to Pedro, you can ask in the chat, or at the end you can ask him directly. So, Helena, thank you.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Patricia. Pedro, yes, I know him for, I think, roughly 20 years or so. As you know, he's a researcher at the eChanges group of CE3C. He's a PhD in ecology, but with a master in GIS, Geographic Information Systems. So we used to call him the map guy. Every time we wanted a map, we would go for him for help. Well, but since the PhD, he has become much more than that. He started with lichens as bioindicators, then moved on to other forms of environmental pollution and several other environmental changes. But now is more focused on urban ecosystems, as you will see next on his presentation. And he has an impressive publication record, one of the highest of CE3C. If you don't know that, go check his CV. But in part, this is also due to his many international projects and collaborations where he's involved. He's also behind the Urban Lab. I don't know if you've seen that. It's one of the CE3C infrastructures. So also go to CE3C website and check for it. And you'll see everyone that is involved. Well, he's done many things, but I think you want to hear him, not me. So I'm very glad to present you a very wonderful member of my team, Pedro Pinho. Please.
Oh, thanks so much, Lena. What a nice presentation. So, hello, everyone. Welcome to this session. I will just go after this very nice presentation by Lena. So, 20 years. Okay, nice. Oops, I'm not share. Okay, as I was talking about this topic, this research agenda for biodiversity and ecosystem services, functional services in Europe. So the idea behind this was to present basically a paper I will show you in a minute. And as Helena was saying, I'm hosted by Faculdade de Ciências at CE3C at eChanges group within CE3C led by Helena. Also involved in the Urban Lab. It's where I've been developing part of my work in the recent years. And the overhanging topic of this talk is around this kind of statement: how to make our cities more sustainable using nature-based solutions and ecosystem services. And this has been an ongoing research, both a research topic and objective, also to communicate with people. Why urban? Well, urban areas are increasingly important for population. You can see in the above graph, the share of urban population in the world has been increasing and will keep to increase in the near future, with the majority of people will live in cities. And that's also related with how urban areas attract somehow wealth. So if you see in the graph below, the more urban population a country has, each dot is a country below, the higher the income, whatever this means for happiness, but for income, this is true. And that's why the urban population will steadily increase in the future. When we look at the urban footprint, meaning the area occupied by actual urban areas, built up areas, areas that people built, the actual footprint is not that big. It's even in Europe, which is about 85% of the urban population, only 2% of the area it's occupied. It's quite a lot still, but it's not that much. This is, of course, because people are concentrated. And the reason why we focus so much on cities is because, of course, there is where most people live. So it's where most resources are consumed, resources, of course, being imported from outside the cities to the cities. So doing anything in cities will allow us to improve our ecological footprint and on the long-term sustainability. And sustainability means many things, can be measured at least in many ways, but it's always looking at consuming resources under a given threshold, that's ecological or environmental sustainability. But we also want to have higher human development. So you can, when you cross these two ideas, higher human development index, meaning the possibility of societies and countries to provide to their citizens health, education, and all the other amenities of life, has to be done at the cost of some ecological consumption, but sustainability can only be achieved in a very narrow band, which basically no country currently is. So European countries, each dot again is a country, and European countries are there highlighted on red, more on the right. Of course, Portugal is somewhere in the middle. And what is happening is that, of course, we are consuming too much resources to obtain the benefits, the human development that we need and want. So one of the many ideas of this to increase sustainability is to increase the resource use efficiency. And the way United Nations have been tackling this issue is to promote the Sustainable Development Goals that you all, most of you will know well. And specifically for urban areas, they've put forward this UN Habitat and the New Urban Agenda. So this is a conference and treaty, and the New Urban Agenda aims at guiding cities, countries, people towards this urban sustainability. So it's the path to that sustainability. And one of the several ways they suggest to do this is to focus on the green and blue part of cities. This means the living part of cities as a way to promote sustainability. And this is also the way we look at cities. So you can see there on the top, we look at the green and blue infrastructure. This is all habitats that occur in a city, no matter how small or big. We try to look at them all as a way that exists in the city, as a way to provide ecosystem services, which is below. So this is all the benefits humans obtain from nature. You have heard of this concept. This includes from more cultural services like the preservation of cultural heritage, when you look, for instance, to a botanical garden, or something more regulation in nature, like the air quality and microclimate regulation. These are all provided by this green and blue infrastructure, which are components and habitats that exist in the city. It can go from coastal dunes in the edge of the cities to the rivers and their edges and ponds that exist in parks, small or large street trees, and even green roofs, totally artificial and constructed parts of the system. And we look at this interaction. Where are the green and blue infrastructure? Where are the habitats? And which ecosystem services they can provide to us? And the way when we interact with stakeholders at municipality level, we interact with them by looking at these nature-based solutions. This means this is kind of building blocks, like Lego blocks, providing a number of ecosystem services and also support biodiversity. For instance, the restoration of sand dunes. You have two examples here from my hometown, Almada, which is sand dune restoration in the coastal areas. So it's a building block that sand dunes will restore. They are providing a number of ecosystem services. In the case of dunes, it's avoidance of coastal erosion. Also below, you have Parque da Paz, and there is a kind of a piece put together, which is retention basins. You can see that large lake in Parque da Paz that some of you will know as a nice area to enjoy. That's also an ecosystem services, but it's also there to serve as a water retention basin. So it's a thing, a nature-based solution that is built for a given objective, with the added benefit that it also supports biodiversity and it's supported by it. So that's part of the research. All these links are established. Going back to that big overhanging question is how to make our cities more sustainable using nature-based solutions and ecosystem services. This was kind of as well the question that we asked at the beginning of a project that we had, which very recently finished, the BioVeins project. It was an Horizon 2020 project with a number of universities and city studies across Europe. And within this project, we have been doing quite some research. Many papers are still are on the line to be published. But on the beginning of this project, we put our minds to think what would be a research agenda for the future, part of it to be followed during the project, part of it to be followed in the near future. And that's what inspired this talk, trying to present you all a number of research questions, research agendas, unknowns for science that we still need to invest more, some more scientific, some are more practical, they are aimed at stakeholders, to research in urban ecology for the near future. The people there on the left are the people that joined the paper, thinking, looking at bibliographic research, what's missing, what's not missing. And that's what we have done, and that's what I will present you. This project, just for you to have an idea, occurred on 7 European cities. It was a biodiversity project. And we have looked at cities across a large climate gradient, sampling for a very high number of taxa within the cities in a very well-established fragmentation and climate gradient across the cities. And to do so, we asked a number of questions that are underpinning this specific talk. So when we establish this research agenda, we end up grouping our research question into this big 5 functional groups. They all relate to some specific part of the city, of the urban area. And I'll try to present each one of them, trying to present you what we have done so far. Many of the examples that I've chosen are from Portugal, some of them are from the other cities. But they are trying to highlight not that what we have done, but also what we have been doing and will do more in the future. So part of this is the unknown. So I'll first present you some examples of what has been done, and then the research question or the research gaps that constitute that research agenda. Now, starting from the trait-based approaches, which is actually one that underpins all the others, I'll try to show you some examples of what we've been doing. What you're seeing now in the map is a map of Almada municipality, where we've been studying a number of taxas as well. And what has been showing there is it's a model that groups both lichens and birds together. And is showing you, being interpolated over the entire municipality, modeled, and is showing you what communities of both birds and lichens are more urban sensitive, they are in green, and the ones that are more urban tolerant, they are in red. This is to highlight that most of the biodiversity per se, the species, the communities, whatever the functional groups that exist in a city, are very dependent on fragmentation. This is pretty obvious. It is expected, but quantifying what exactly is the vegetation structure associated to these differences is not so obvious. But then again, there is a strong influence on habitat fragmentation. In this case, habitat fragmentation means not only the size of the fragment, this is forest remnants in Almada, but also the matrix, how hostile is the matrix. Using those 2 components, we were able to model this for the entire municipality. And of course, when we have more urban sensitive, the ones that are more prone to be forest-like species of both birds and lichens, they coincide more or less with the areas that, of course, have more forest around them. But this is another vision. Now, also in Almada, Parque da Paz, what you see there in the center is Parque da Paz. Several columns represent an index of ecosystem services. This is the ecosystem services being separated one by one. So we have 6 ecosystem services. They are the colors here below. And below is the way, this line here is the way we have measured those ecosystem services. Many of them were measured using either total diversity or functional, some measure of functional diversity, could be lichens, could be birds, could be vegetation. What I want to highlight here is that all these ecosystem services and the trade-offs, we cannot maximize all ecosystem services at once in the park, greatly depend on vegetation structure. The type of vegetation structure that exists in each one of these colors, from the big open lawns to the more closed forest here, greatly influence the type of services. And this is actually good. This is a general conclusion. It's related to functional diversity, vegetation structure, the amount of trees, type of trees, the amount of layers in vegetation, something that is roughly there as vegetation structure and complexity, opposing to another side, which is management intensity, greatly influence both the biodiversity and the services provided. This is something good, actually, because it's easy. It's the only thing in the cities, in the habitats that we can actually manage. We cannot import, export birds, certainly not insects, of course, not fungi, but at least we can manage vegetation structure complexity. So this management something that we can use to communicate with stakeholders. You can manage vegetation, structure, and complexity to achieve a given objectives regarding ecosystem services. So overall, this trait-based approach, this was just a very brief summary of what we've been doing. We have come up with this idea, how can we improve or use the trait-based approach overall? And two things that I want to highlight. One, the only way we have to provide this mechanism linking the presence of biodiversity to ecosystem functions and then ecosystem services is by looking at this functional groups and a trait-based approach. So once we can identify them, that will at least give us hint on the mechanisms that support them. And this is also a very strong component of applied components, because it's by managing vegetation and the functional diversity that we can point to better strategies for restoration and conservation in cities. Now, going for another part of the research agenda, habitat mapping. Habitat mapping is their signal with a satellite, and the reason for this is much of what we do on habitat mapping and looking at not only habitat mapping, but also process mapping is done by satellite. What you see there is not a Portuguese city, it's not a city in Sweden with a very high green areas. And this is what is usually done, looking at very high spatial resolution satellite information, and you can get a pretty good idea of where is green and where is not. However, this is not enough. So we always want to go one step above that. Habitats are much smaller, and there's a number of things that we want to know. I put here another work done by Filipe Grillo, and this is not remote sensing, what you see in the maps above. This is a model, and the question here was, if we have these squares that have vegetation, do they influence the microclimate outside of those squares? And what type of functional groups of vegetation does that? So we end up looking at, okay, this vegetation does not only influence the microclimate, you can see temperature and relative humidity. The areas in blue are, of course, the parks, and the adjacent areas are, of course, the plazas. But we could see there was an influence that stretched up to 60 meters from the park that was supplied by the trees. Now, when we look at this and we think of how can we map the habitats, the trees, the small pockets of grasses and the isolated trees within a city, and even one step beyond, what are the processes, the evaporation and the shadow of trees that causes this microclimate regulation, we have a bunch of questions that are not so easy to tackle and to address. So habitat mapping here, it's a general meaning for, we have to be able to look at cities and try to create these ecological, meaningful habitat-based maps. For instance, when you look at, there is Corinne, it's not useful for cities, it's too wide, but there is something called the European Urban Atlas. And when we go for the European Urban Atlas, which is a terrific tool that standardizes things more or less all across Europe, which is a terrific tool. But when you look at the habitats, the green and blue part of the cities, there's only 3 categories. There's not detail, and the size of them is not enough. So when we mean to create ecological meaning habitats, meaning that we have to somehow be able to increase by a lot, by at least one order, factor of order, the resolution of those maps so that we can include most habitats within a city. And there's also something else, which was somehow we have to be able to detect the processes that underlie these ecosystem services. How this vegetation evaporates, when it evaporates, what are the functional groups, of course, that evaporate water one way or another, that creates some type of shadow, for instance. So higher resolution, both in terms of spatial resolution, temporal resolution, of course, but also how can we look into the processes that link biodiversity and the provision of ecosystem services and the functions they have in ecosystems. Now going for another part of the research agenda, looking at complex environments. This is something I think every biologist that is watching is used to, whatever area they are working in. But it also occurs in cities. So I give you 2 examples there. One of them is how vegetation, this is again Almada, the same example as before, looking at another functional group, but how vegetation that exists in a city controls microclimate. We have seen this by looking at lichens that are more or less sensitive to aridity. Remember, it's not lichens that provide the ecosystem services, it's the vegetation. The lichens are just indicators of it. Just have to highlight this. But when we look at this, it's again vegetation structure. And when we look at lichens, we get this map, basically. The main factor driving communities and functional diversity in lichens is the urban island effect. You can see there in red, the areas of the municipality more prone to this urban island effect, the fact that urban areas are hotter and drier than the surroundings, and the opposing here in the more, of course, coastal, but also nearby the forest. When we go a bit to the north and go to Lisbon, most of you will know this kind of map. This is Lisbon, Lisbon municipality. There's another service that we can see. And when we go inside the parks of Lisbon, and the top map, it's colored according to the number of species, and it's indicating as how much air quality regulation the parks themselves are providing. So when we look at Lisbon, we have the function of air quality regulation. We can also do some more exercises looking how, if we extract the local scale variance from the main data, we can also have a look at the background air pollution, which is below. You can see there it's downtown areas of Nida Liberdade and going upwards, and also the areas downwind of the airport, the pollution area that comes from the airport. We can have a look at this data at a small and a large scale. So there is this difference. But overall, the main message here is that even in two areas that are adjacent, what is happening is that when we look at biodiversity, and this happens to everyone working with biodiversity, the first stance is that we get the vision of the main factor influencing biodiversity. If in Almada, we have the urban island effect because we have less pollution, when we have more pollution, like in Lisbon, a lot more traffic and a lot less air coming from the ocean, the main factor is air pollution, and that's what we see in biodiversity. This happens, of course, with everyone. But the problem is when we want to compare cities, and even two cities that are adjacent to each other, there's also a river between them. We want to go to European level, and we want to compare cities. This becomes tricky. We can only see the main factor. That's not a good thing if you want to compare it. So when we look at these complex environments, this means when we have several factors superimposed affecting biodiversity, you really want to be able to disentangle them. And why disentangle them does not mean only to quantify the variance associated if the factors are significant or not, because many times we have to give an answer to stakeholders that manage the city. So we have to say exactly where and what is affecting biodiversity so that we can take some action. So it's not enough to be able to understand if it's significant or not. It's actually to disentangle, to separate. And that work is, for instance, being tried out by Bernardo Rocha, who is doing also the PhD. But so one of the many things we have to do in the future is try to continue to disentangle the effects of multiple drivers. And you have there, I've been only mentioning the environmental or ecological drivers. There's also cultural, social, and economical dimensions to add to this, especially because when we have biodiversity, we have ecosystem services. So there's a big unknown in this disentangle on biodiversity that will transmit to higher levels like ecosystem function and ecosystem services. There's, of course, also the thing in cities that we have to look at new species assemblages in cities, including these exotic species. And now these species are becoming more or less adapt to the changing environment, especially to these complex new environments that are created in cities, which I did not mention. Now going also for another aspect of this research agenda that we considered important, it is the need to engage citizens. Citizens are part of the entire planet. They are people, are an important part of the planet. In cities, it's more than obvious that occurs. And more than engaging citizens is engaging everyone that has something to say about the cities. The people that live there, the scientists, the municipality authorities, everyone that lives and uses cities should be somehow engaged in this. Now, many times the way we do this is by citizen science, for instance. This is a project that has been going on biodiverse cities in 13 cities across Europe, and each city is testing a way to engage citizens. In Portugal, we're doing two works. One of them uses an application to quantify vegetation structure. I've highlighted why vegetation structure is so important. The other work is done by Raquel, and Raquel is looking at engaging school children in biodiversity studies, looking at the curricular and doing some activities. Now, this kind of project is important so that we can compare what are the best strategies to involve citizens, not only in biodiversity in species per se, not only the existence of species, but also in this passage from species to ecosystem services and ecosystem functions. That's the hard part of engaging people, because it's not such an easy message. And going a bit even beyond that, we've been recently involved in the launch of this competence center on participatory and deliberative democracy. Long name, basically to tell people that they have power and they have a way to provide the means of doing so. Biodiversity is one component of this competence center. It's biodiversity, engaging people. And many things we've been doing is try to look at the barriers that prevent people from going further. And one of the ways people refer things like bureaucracy, hierarchy, and so on. This has been done in this European Week of Cities and Region. But one of the things that has been more and more obvious is the lack of results from people engagement. People do engage, people have knowledge, and if people don't have the knowledge, they will search for it in an easy manner, more or less easy manner. But it's the consequences that are lacking. So one of the barriers for this is the consequences of these actions that people take. There are other ways to engage stakeholders. There are other stakeholders. We ourselves are stakeholders that use the university. There's something called Laboratório Vivo, Centralidade em Ciências. You can have a look at the faculty webpage, and it's a way to look at us as stakeholders, as users of the faculties, to make the entire faculty more sustainable. This is also a way. We have seen some projects like Patricia as the Mais Biodiversidade de Ciências. It's one of those components, trying to engage everyone on board, trying to make a campus more sustainable over a number of actions that go from residuals, energy, biodiversity, the building. It's quite interesting. You should visit this webpage to look at how one campus, one big community, there's a lot of us at school, can be more sustainable in one common way. Beyond those stakeholders that exist in the city, there's also a lot of other stakeholders that they're not the common citizens. They are the folks that manage the cities or the engineers that are behind all the other aspects of the city. And this circular city cost action, I've been participating on it. It's mainly dominated by water engineers. They look at water cycles, the way water circulates in the city. And for example, you have that example there below, where in a more kind of natural landscape, agriculture and forests, what happens to the water that rains? Most of it circulates within the ecosystem, providing some service, while when compared to an urban area, of course, most water just runoffs of the city. So many of the goals of this cost action is to make cities more circular, not only relating water, but also energy. And the way I put this example here is because it's interacting with people. Many times I'm water engineer, and we spend a lot of time looking at what happens to this circularity in cities. And how can you use nature-based solutions, those elements like that ponds that we put in a park, or dune restoration, or building a green roof, can provide ecosystem services. And we spend a lot of time discussing and looking at what are the functions of the soil, of the building materials, of the orientation, of the building procedures, building codes, legislation that guide the construction of that nature-based solution. And on the end, they say we put plants. And the thing is that I try to, and even shout sometimes at them, because after 3 or 4 times that they just put plants on the end. And the reasoning that's behind this is that plants are an added value. We have to keep explaining that biodiversity matters to the nature-based solution functioning. They are the ones that are actually making the thing functioning. So if we also look at the type of substrate, the type of material that's going in that nature-based solution, also we have to look at the functional diversity that is being put into that nature-based solution, the type of plants that go into green roof, the type of plants and that go into a park, whatever we built matter to the actual functioning of that. So if you think it's not easy to convince citizens, it's also not easy to convince other stakeholders that manage the more grayish infrastructure, that the built-up area. So into engaging citizens and stakeholders, there's this standard sampling protocols. And it's not only sampling protocols, perhaps that's too small, but standardization is really important. The way we sample the benefits, we measure the benefits of biodiversity must be quite standardized across areas of knowledge, across countries even, the better. And they have to include this error reporting. This is really important if we want to go one step forward with this nature-based solutions. And also there's this idea of supporting bottom-up initiative, and it's their citizen science, but I think it's more general. We have to support bottom-up initiatives of any kind that are included somehow to increase our democratic participation in the life of cities. Finally, for the last research idea is this neglected habitats. Now, I think every biologist will have a grasp, an idea of what these neglected habitats are. Obviously, water is one of the most striking habitats in a city. Soil, for sure, is another one. Also, the light, the night time, it's not so obvious. It's also a neglected habitat in the city. But I'll try to highlight something else, which is the interaction. This is a project that we've been participating in, and Margarita and Reis monitoring Lisbon biodiversity, looking at the many habitats within a city, looking at many species that exist in those habitats. Remember, we can manage the habitats, but of course not the species that go into them. This is quite so interesting. And how the way the spatial arrangement of these urban habitats can guarantee more or less one type of community to them. Looking how much is the area occupied between 24 and 40% will kind of start to guarantee a community both of birds and bats. That's more the ones that are more sensitive, that need more green areas. But besides looking at this small and unusual habitats, like for instance, these marshes that exist in Lisbon, surprisingly, very few, they are the most unique. It's also the way that species that depend on several habitats live and coexist. This is an example done in several European cities. Wild bees that host their larvae in small holes, and they feed the larvae with several plant families. And what you can see there is 4 bee species. This bird species, this bee species only feeds in every cities, on the cities that exist, on a single plant family, so it's more specialist regarding the feeding. This one, it's the opposite corner. It exists in all the cities, but it feeds their larvae with a whole range of plant family. So it has a broad diet. So we ask ourselves if this diet specialization did influence the resistance or tolerance to urban intensity, the amount of urban around them. And we end up seeing that in general, species with a broad diet, like this one, are less sensitive to urban intensity. It's this red line here. It doesn't really change as we go from a more vegetation rich to a more urban area, opposing to those that have a more narrow diet that are influenced. Of course, that this in red again, that have a narrow niche, have a broader niche, they feed on a lot of plants, they will always prefer the ones that provide them a lot of plant family species. They will always prefer annual sites with annual plants, grasslands, meadows, opposing to those that have mostly trees. But this is here to highlight that when we look at biodiversity in a city, we have to look not only to the interactions, okay, this is landscape, but also the way that several taxa use several parts of the habitats of the ecosystem. This is also true for bats, for instance, bats that use some flower resources that influence insects that in turn are used by bats, some insect species that depend both on the river and on the margins and terrestrial ecosystems. So this is a whole range of ecosystems that have to be studied, and they are neglected, not only because the habitats themselves are neglected, it's because the habitats between habitats are neglected. So in general, I propose to understand the species responses to and explore niches, but it's important to be able to do this across taxa, how they interact between themselves across the cities, because they will not use a single habitat, and also to compare regions or cities in several regions. And also to look at the way that the single species will be able to adapt to different conditions. Again, it's the adaptation, both phenotypic and actual adaptation to the urban environmental ecosystem. That is something that people will research more in the future. So I will end now this presentation. This is again the overall picture with the 5 big groups of the research agenda: the unknown gaps, the traits, the urban habitat mapping, citizen and stakeholders involvement, the multiple ingredients, and also the neglected habitats that we have been looking. Now we'll end here, and of course I'm open to your questions.
Thank you so much, Pedro. It was a great presentation. So now we have plenty of time for discussion and questions for Pedro. I don't know who wants to start. Maybe I will just stop sharing just for us to see everybody. Yes. So we have questions for Pedro. We have Professor Amélia Louçã. Congratulations. So I don't know who have questions. Right, clear.
I have.
Everything. Okay, great.
Yes. Well, I liked very much. I knew only a part of the work, so it was very fruitful for me to hear all the things that you have to say. But one thing that I would like to ask you is what have been your relations with the different chambers, municipalities, both in Lisbon and in Almada. Almada probably, I know that it has been a long-term running, so the relations are much better. But thinking that we just finished Lisbon green city, so what it was the reception, what it was the things that you have received from all these studies, because what we see here in the city is only small arrangements of gardening, not good things, at least for me.
Yeah, okay. I think this, because comparing to Europe, I'm not sure when we look at Europe and when we used to visit European cities 2 years ago, I think we saw a big change, and especially when we could somehow revisit the cities from 10 years difference, there was a big change, especially in Northern Europe. Suddenly cities become open, the rivers became open to the air, rivers were restored, there was a lot of people enjoying the areas. So I noted a few big changes in cities in Northern Europe, in Central Northern Europe. And this, I think, came from this ecosystem services perspective that people somehow integrated. I don't know how it got to them, to those municipalities, if it was scientists, if it was the municipalities, but it works. So I think cities change a lot on this perspective. When we go to Lisbon, Almada, the Portuguese cities, I don't see that much of a difference, although I see some small actions, as you were saying. In Almada, I don't think it has also been quite point specific. So we worked with a specific department in Almada. They would be able to do specific actions that worked, like dune restoration work, some river restoration. I think it also ended up. In Lisbon, I don't think it was a consequence of our direct work with them. But if you think the big engineering works at Praça de Espanha, that was a consequence of trying to increase infiltration uphill, preventing the water from going downhill. So I think actually Lisbon did promote a series of actions aimed at promoting ecosystem services, even if it was not direct course of our work directly. But I think those actions are there. They are probably not as highlighted in the news. Things like the Pratos de Queiro, translation miss me, that they've been implementing throughout. The restoration of the peripheral parks was done based on this analysis. So I think at the moment, or at least the people that were there, were quite open to this approach. I have no idea, of course, how it's going to be in the future, but I think the seed is there. People are becoming increasingly aware, and the people that work at the municipalities also have their own agenda groups. They have the municipality, they group together and discuss, and ecosystem services and functions is a part of their discussion. So independently even of our will, they will take it forward in the ways that they can understand and manage it. Specifically, how our work interacts with the municipalities, I have to say it's a Portuguese answer kind of, but it depends on the people. When we relate well to the people, we end up relating well to the action. We can do some action. In my case, people like municipality of Almada, or in Lisbon, specific people like the library, Lisbon's Library Association, that is very interested in promoting sustainability. So when we get to know the people, we get to know the work. This is perhaps too case specific, but I think it's quite spread in Portugal. I suspect it's going to be working that way for some time.
I guess Tiziana also wants to ask something.
Oh, yes. Thank you very much, Pedro. I really enjoyed your presentation and congratulations for BioVeins. I'm a groundwater ecologist, and so I'm speaking for a plea for considering groundwater as a neglected habitat. And green cities are providing huge ecosystem services to groundwater ecosystems. They are full of life. The biodiversity is huge, dominated by crustaceans, and rare species. And unfortunately, groundwater ecosystems are facing increasing of groundwater temperature due to climate change. And under the big cities, the groundwater temperature is also increasing because of the heat of the cities. And actually, groundwater temperature under the big cities is 6 centigrades more higher than the groundwater around the cities. So green cities will provide huge ecosystem benefit services to groundwater. And I would like to know if in your future perspective, future research, are you considering to include groundwater ecosystem in your research, in your projects? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Tiziana. Yes, groundwater recharge is one of the most striking and most affected ecosystem services in cities, and also its biodiversity. While we built cities, of course, biodiversity changed dramatically. Whatever came to colonize depended on that urbanization. Groundwater biodiversity and soil biodiversity, but especially groundwater biodiversity, was affected slowly and is slowly affected. So I suspect what we see in groundwater, I don't know much about groundwater biodiversity, is still affected, is still changing, and it's affected by what allow it to infiltrate, the amount and the quality. On ecosystem service perspective, I'm mostly interested to see how does the biodiversity that exists in the soil or in the space open between the soil can increase water quality. Of course, that's one of the main things that we have to think. And of course, water recharge of the aquifers themselves. But that's a very interesting perspective. We have, of course, identified that area, the water. Water is always missing in projects. We have submitted a biodiversity project that deals with water biodiversity, but not looking so much, I think, in what you were saying, which is the biodiversity that exists underground in the aquifers and so on. And at that perspective, we did not, which is a pity. Although we'll try to look at environmental data. I think environmental DNA will come to help us, because it's very hard, of course, to sample biodiversity, not only because it's hard to reach, but it's also complex and diverse. But we will look at environmental DNA. And if there's a difference between, if there's some signal that can separate the different types of nature-based solutions that exist in the city, that somehow influence what's below, because this is a kind of a influence from top to bottom, that will be very interesting to see. So although it is there, but it's not very obvious. But after your question, I'll look at it in a more careful way. Many thanks, Tiziana.
Thank you very much.
I don't know if there are more questions. I have one, at least, just to ask you. I don't know. Well, Lisbon were the Portuguese green capital, and there were lots of projects happening, and then suddenly COVID appeared, and lots of things changed. I was wondering if in some of these projects you had to adapt the project to a different perspective, because some of these adaptations are quite nice. Because they worked well, and it was nice to see how people had to reinvent the projects, at least considering citizens, when some well, some projects were, well, in your case, were quite
Yes.
connected with citizens. So I don't know if you have any experience.
Yeah, that's some example. Of course, we have to adapt all projects to COVID like everyone else, and that includes citizen engagement and citizen doing stuff. I think the best example I think it's a nice example anyway, that when we worked with schools for some projects for engaging with school, usually we go to schools and present them ecosystem services and so on, a number of things that small children have to look at. This time it was not possible to go to schools, of course. They were still at schools happily, but we could not go there. It was not allowed people outside the school to go there. So they ended up doing a remote session. But before that session, I asked the professors to ask the children to go outside with smartphones, and take pictures of what they've seen as being that could be successfully changed using nature-based solutions. So the professor had to explain to the children what were nature-based solutions, what were ecosystem services. So well, I'm saying children, but they are 12 to 14 years old, they're not that small. So they could have a smartphone and go there. And they are involve a lot in that thing, because each one could go to their own place outside the school. So it was an individual activity, which people really enjoy. It was their own site. So instead of coming to us at university and looking at our examples, the biggest benefit of this was they could look to their own examples. And this is something that's it's hard to do. And it was actually about something that to come out good of this, is that we could go experience the sites. Older people told me that, okay, I went to this park nearby my house and it was really nice. I never visited. And they could go, and it was an individual thing. So they end up going there individually. So it was an adaptation that ended up resulting well. People could experience and look at the green area under new lens, under the lens of ecosystem services, under their own personal lens, of course. So it was a good individual experience that people had. Of course, on the end, I'm speaking there with the students, interacting and looking at their doubts in the eyes. So it was it was quite bad for questions and doubts, because there was no way I could look at 80 people in the small squares of Zooms and trying to see what are their doubts, what are they thinking. But for their experience, it was nice. So I guess this is somehow related with COVID, that ended up being good and bad.
Yeah, I don't know if more questions. Still have some minutes. No, I don't think we have any other. Of course, the talk will stay available in YouTube. So if later you want to contact Pedro with other questions or ideas, I think
yes, please
can all. So I think we are going to end here. And then next week we have another Encontro Ciência at the same time and with the same link. So if anyone wants to join, it will be the same link for the next Encontro Ciência. So thank you so much and have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.